Joined now by James Heappey, the Armed Forces Minister. Hello, Mr Heappey. I want to ask you about what Jens Stoltenberg has been saying to us, but first, I know that you are a father yourself. Thoughts on the incident in Liverpool?
Yeah, my kids are about the same age, and you know, the language that your reporter used, and as you just observed, the senselessness of just reaching around a door and ending a 9-year-old life is it's pretty shocking, and it makes you reflect on how safe you do feel in your own home. What's extraordinary is that, as your reporter so eloquently set out, lots of people saw parts of what unfolded in Liverpool, and the police need those people to understand that those who kill 9-year-olds need to be brought to justice, and the information that they hold, no matter how fearful they may be of sharing it, could be key to achieving some justice for Olivia and her family. Everybody in government wants those who saw what happened yesterday to come forward with the information they have so that Merseyside police can bring those responsible to book.
Jamie Carragher's called for an increase in the sentences for gun and knife crimes. Is now the time to start looking at that again?
Well, I don't think that only a few hours after such a barbaric incident, it's right for a government minister to say that there must be a policy change. But moments like this obviously focus minds, and I'm sure that when the new government comes together, it's these sorts of events that cause discussions for the new Home Secretary and the new Justice Secretary. But I will leave it to them. In the meantime, what everybody, I hope, agrees is that getting information to the police so that their investigation can proceed quickly and the people responsible be brought to justice is what matters most.
As I mentioned just before we came to you, Mr Heappey, we have an exclusive interview with the NATO chief, that's Jens Stoltenberg, a little bit later on this hour. I spoke to him yesterday, and he was basically saying 2% GDP is what NATO countries are supposed to pledge. Not all of them do. I know that you will tell me that the UK does. I get that. He's saying probably need more.
Yeah, and I think that's right. The security situation in the Euro-Atlantic has profoundly changed in the last year or so. And as we see, tensions continue to rise in the Far East, in the South China Sea. So it does feel like we are at a sort of epoch change in our security situation, and thus the spending that's required. In fairness, Liz Truss, who I'm supporting to be our next Prime Minister, has committed to spending 3% of GDP, as you just heard Jens say, was now required. She's committed to do that by the end of the decade, with increases in defence spending every year on the way to that. But to be fair, because this morning I'm speaking to you from a Department of State, and I don't think it's right to use it as a platform for a leadership contender, Rishi Sunak has also said he will increase defence spending, not quite to the same level, but nonetheless he has said that he will increase our defence spending too.
Yeah, 2.5% and 3% respectively. But, you know, I also heard from Jens Stoltenberg. He said that we are now on a Cold War footing. He was talking about increasing the numbers of NATO troops from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. Our percentage GDP spending during the Cold War was 9%. I mean, is that something that we might be looking at?
Well, look, I mean, 3% is a 50% uplift in the defence budget from what it was only a couple of years ago. That is a huge amount of money with which safeguards a number of really important upgrades to the UK's strategic and tactical capabilities. So I think 3% by the end of the decade is a great commitment. It will transform our defence capabilities. Whether or not we ever need to get back to the levels that were required in the Cold War depends on the success we have in containing Russia in its belligerence in Ukraine and in the way that the US-Chinese relationship develops in the Pacific. But 3% should not be dismissed as a sort of interim figure. 3% is an enormous commitment for any government to make. And if we are led by Prime Minister Truss in a few weeks' time, that's a commitment she's made. And it will mean that beyond the US, the UK remains by far the largest defence spender in NATO, and we will have set an example for other European countries to follow.
Yeah, but we're not ruling out doing what's necessary in order to keep our people safe, are we?
Of course not, Kay. And no, nobody ever would, not only in the Ministry of Defence, but around the whole of government. Defence is expensive, but 3% is a very important announcement.
Okay.
And that shouldn't be brushed aside as not enough. It would be the second largest defence budget in NATO.
So much of us, so many of us, I should say, are concentrating very much on the cost of living crisis here at the moment, and that is very much linked to the price of gas went up 34% earlier on this week because of the situation in Ukraine and the reaction by Russia. At what stage do we have to think, as much as we have much sympathy for the people in Ukraine, we need to make sure that people in the UK are looked after, and we have to look again at what's happening with our relationship with Russia?
No, I mean, I think that I can understand why lots of people eating their breakfast and worrying about the cost of living will be agreeing with the premise of your question that, you know, there is arguably the most straightforward solution to the cost of living crisis is that we re-establish relations with Russia and everything goes back to the way that it was in the European energy market. Every single thing that I have seen in the last 6 months tells me that that would be catastrophic for security in the Euro-Atlantic, and thus not on some 10 or 15 or 20-year horizon, but within just a few years, we would find ourselves in a situation where an emboldened Russia was causing cost of living challenges that are 100 times worse than what we're seeing right now, because they might seek to expand their ambitions beyond Ukraine and into NATO territory in the Baltic, for example. We have to stand up for Ukraine, with Ukraine, so that this all ends on Zelensky's terms. Because if we do not, whatever the short-term pain and cost might be, we set the conditions for security in the Euro-Atlantic, and, by the way, an emboldened President Xi in the South China Sea to make the next 20 years on this planet really uncomfortable, really dangerous, and really expensive.
Final question before I let you go, Minister, if you wouldn't mind. Scottish Power, one of the UK's largest energy companies, has proposed a plan to the Business Secretary to freeze energy bills for 2 years. That would cost around £100 billion, forgive me. To put that into context, that's more than the furlough scheme cost in its totality. What's the government's response?
Well, these are eye-watering amounts of money, and yet, on the context of COVID, they're the sorts of amounts of money we speak of routinely for interventions. I don't think that a universal freezing of everybody's energy bill really helps to get taxpayers' money into the bank accounts of the people who need support the most. That's why I think that the more targeted packages, to be fair, both leadership candidates are proposing, are probably the better solution. But what everybody needs to know whilst watching your show this morning, Kay, is that the government of the United Kingdom is going to help them with the cost of living. There's lots that's already being done, but I know that it will be the first priority for the new Prime Minister to make sure that the government does more to help them through the really expensive winter that lies ahead.
OK. Thank you, Minister, as always.